Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Filkins. Welcome to the Simon's Rock Poetry and Fiction Series. I would encourage you to turn on your speaker view so that we can feature folks full screen, and we'll be seeing Mona Simpson full screen when the reading begins in a moment. This event is being recorded, so you should know that. And I'd ask you to please silence your mics now so that we don't have background noise coming in during the reading. There will be a Q&A following Mona's reading, and this is a live Zoom link with everyone present. We're trying to replicate as best we can the intimacy of Simon's Rock readings in the past. And so rather than doing a webinar, we're inviting you all to be here. And if you have a question to ask in the Q&A, you can simply raise your hand. And I will call upon you, and you can ask your question that way. If you feel better about posing your question in the chat, I will be monitoring that. There's also the little icon of a hand raised that you have available down on the lower right of your Zoom call too. Before I introduce Mona, I want to remind folks that we were very pleased to host Brigitte Sharma a couple of weeks ago, an alumna of Simon's Rock. She was our book one reader this year and her volume of poetry, Grief Sequence, which was wonderful to hear. And in a month's time, on Thursday, October 22nd, we're going to be having Valeria Luiselli, who will be visiting virtually at 7:30 p.m. Thursday, October 22nd. We are also in the works right now of launching a book discussion group of Valeria's novel Lost Children Archive, which I will be hosting 2 days prior to her reading on Tuesday, October 20th at 7:30 p.m. So I would encourage you to check the Simon's Rock calendar of events for the announcement and links and invitation or registration for that event, which will be coming out probably next week. And then lastly, but not leastly, Peter Gizzi, poet from University of Massachusetts, will be reading on Tuesday, November 17th at 7:30 p.m. And the links for that will again the link for that will be on the Simon's Rock calendar of events page. So I encourage you to follow through and come back for all of our readings. Since her 1986 debut novel, Anywhere But Here, Mona Simpson has traced the tangled web of human relations the tangled web of American families with wit and grace, deconstructing the treachery and deceit that can poison human relations in order to restore hard-won dignity to the everyday lives she vividly portrays. Quote, "We come into the world whole, all of us," she writes in Casebook, her most recent novel. But we don't know that life will be taking large chunks out of us forever. The novel's narrator, a boy of 9 at the start and of college age by the end, asks himself, after years of trying to figure out the reasons for his parents' divorce, what did other people feel? It's a question at the heart of the novel's project as an art form. And Mona Simpson's gift lies in her ability to answer it by allowing possible meanings to assemble, like a puzzle that can be put together in different ways. Empathetic to his mother's suffering at a critical point, the narrator thinks, maybe that was the parents' job, to substitute a comprehensible sadness for the horror of random evil. While not backing away from the latter, Simpson's novels delineate and manifest the former, the result being our own immersion into the algebra of how life is, how we live it, and thankfully, how it can be given shape and meaning in the hands of a gifted artist. The author of 6 works of fiction, Mona Simpson is the recipient of a Whiting Prize, Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts grant, and a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Prize. She is also a Faulkner finalist and received a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2008. She teaches at Bard College in Annandale, and I'm very pleased to welcome her back to Simon's Rock tonight, and pleased to welcome Mona Simpson.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I think, Peter, I started reading your work the first time I came to Simon's Rock, probably more than 20 years ago. And Peter's been one of the poets I regularly read ever since. It's a great thing about poetry that one goes back to it again and again. I'm going to read tonight a short story, just because it's always easier to read a short story than it is to read from novels. And this is a relatively new story called Wrong Object, which is a psychoanalytic term. So this is Wrong Object. He is a nondescript man. I'd never used that adjective about a client, not until this one, my 17th. He'd requested an evening time and came on Tuesdays at 6:30. For months, he didn't tell me what he did. That first session, I said what I often say to begin: how can I help you? I still think of what I do as a helping profession. And I liked the way the phrase echoed down my years. In my first job, I'd been a salesgirl at a department store counter. I want to work on my marriage, he said. I'm the problem. His complaint was familiar, but I preferred a self-critical patient to a blamer. It's me, he said. My wife is a thoroughly good person. Yawn, I thought, but said, tell me more. I don't feel what I should for her. What do you feel? Gratitude, I suppose. And when I think of leaving, pity. What do you wish you experienced? He slumped in my old chair. I just signed the lease. The furniture I'd ordered hadn't come yet. I don't feel enchantment or the hope that we can make each other better. Married 10 years, together 13, but I never had that. That being enchantment. He shrugged. All the things people say about being in love. I never felt she was necessarily the one, he said. The one, I repeated. That we were destined for each other. Do you have children? 3. How about you, Doc? Do you think love is just a solitary fantasy system? I believe in the existence of good fits, I said. I took notes after each session. Most therapists allow 10 or 15 minutes between patients, but I scheduled mine a half hour apart. That first year, I had a notebook in a different color for each. His was brown, and the pages for our first 6 sessions were almost empty. Talks about wife, what a good person she is. Annoying, I wrote. The blankness I felt regarding this patient, I'll call him K, may have been his most distinctive quality. My notes on other patients ran long. I found K boring. I didn't particularly like him, and I liked having patients I liked. From week 9, I wrote, his wife, C, has an internal compass, whereas he's not lying and grabbing and snatching because he's afraid of being caught. How do you know? I asked. I noted that when he said lion and grabbing and snatching, he said it in caricatured Ebonics. K, visibly not black, I wrote. If pressed, what could I have said? That K was slender and nearly bald, that he was in his 40s. He dressed in the style of our Southern California community, good hard shoes, but no jacket. Often he wore a gray collared sweater, soft, close-fitting, probably cashmere. I wondered where he bought it. The shirts my husband chose faintly bothered me. For the past 8 years, Kay had been counsel for a trans-Pacific company. I knew this because I'd Googled. He still didn't talk about his work, except once to tell me he'd have to cancel because he would be flying to Asia. Kay devoted our sessions to his wife and the minor problems of the rich. He'd bought a painting that was possibly a fake. He winced talking about his relationship with the dealer. I suggested that Kay cultivate dreams by keeping a notebook on the bedside table, but he claimed not to dream. He liked his wife to color her hair. Was that wrong of him? He asked me this and didn't notice my hand going rogue to my head, where wiry white strands curled out from the dark. He decided to buy her a purse. He actually unfolded a picture to show me. See? It's made to look like a plastic shopping bag from Chinatown. I loved that purse. I told my supervisor about Kay at our monthly training session. Kay had had a fight with his wife who wanted the children to wash their own clothes. I'd said that everyone needs to learn how to do laundry. Kay had shrugged with a look of almost pleasurable guilt. I never did, he said. What about in college? Harvard has a laundry service, he said, flicking his wrist. I hated him a little then. I'd not gone to Harvard, and I still did laundry, too much of it. In that gesture of Kay's, I saw what I feared a lot of people, my husband's family, maybe even my patrician supervisor, really thought of me, that I was less because I had been poor. My supervisor was a very old, very tall man, a legend in the Los Angeles analytic community. He carried an aura of glamour, even then, in his 80s. I told him about the purse. I don't think you're less, he said. I admire you for having made your own way. A lot of the time, Kay bored me, I admitted. My supervisor smiled, an expression of his never without a trace of pain. In the 70s, he said, a village priest asked the great Dr. Winnicott how to differentiate between a parishioner who could benefit from talking and someone who needed professional help. Winnicott said, if he is boring you, then he is sick and he needs psychiatric treatment. From the door, as I was leaving, I turned back to ask Dr. Baer, where did you go to college? The farm, he answered. Then, seeing my confusion, he explained, Stanford, we used to call it the farm. I don't know if they still do. That same day, in the coffee shop near my office, I saw the purse. A young mother had hooked it over her stroller handle. I immediately searched for it online. $1,700. Another spat with his wife. Kay wanted to visit Alaska. His descriptions of the wildlife were tender, reverential. He wanted to see the willow tarbacan's feathered feet, snowy owls, loons, the endangered stellar eider. In a decade, he said, so much will be gone. C told him she planned to stay put. I suggested that that sounded cold. He defended her then, as if I'd attacked, which I suppose I had. She has more important responsibilities, he said, than swanning around the world with me. Let's talk about our relationship, I said. Our relationship? Yes. We spent a good deal of time discussing your feelings about your wife. Let's consider what's going on right now in this room and whether or not that's satisfying. This is a relationship we could end without damage. Our relationship, he said again. I hadn't really thought of us as having one. I'm all right with you. Really? I said, because I'm not sure I've been able to help you. Sometimes I feel we go over the same territory. Well, that's probably my fault, he said. I haven't talked about everything, but I suppose that's what I'm here for. And then he told me. At the time, I had a pencil in my hand and I wrote down the date, January 28th, 2012. I'm a pedophile, he said. The problem with my wife isn't. I've never been enchanted with anyone her age, which is to say my age. The light in my office made him look dangerously thin, pretzeled on the corduroy chair. My furniture had finally arrived. Kay was the only one of my clients to notice. I was aware of the narrowness of his shoulders in the gray-collared sweater, the niceness of his socks. All the hair on my arms stood up. There are questions I want to ask, I interrupted, but I need you to be aware first that in the state of California, I will be required to report you if, don't worry, he said. I've never touched a child. I never will, that's not why. Not a possibility. I have too much to lose. And it'd be wrong, I get that. I have 3 kids. As he talked in an even voice, I felt for the first time that we were in something together. Okay, I said, sitting back. I had 100 questions. What age children, girls or boys? When did this start? Were you abused? That's what everybody probably think, right? But I don't think so. There were strange things, but he was not completely bald. He had a kind of hair I'd seen around LA the past few years. What time had left had been shaved at the length of a crew cut, but one absolutely distinguished from the military forms of that style. All of a sudden, his look entered the lexicon of handsome. It seemed not only that I could fall in love with this person, in the way therapists fall in love with the poignancy of renunciation, but that whatever that motion was, like a rope being shaken, it had already begun. We spent the next several months hunting down a sexual predator in Kay's past. I saw the population outside my office differently during that time. People in my coffee shop appeared heroic. I began to believe that many carried damage and made it their purpose not to pass that damage on. March 8th, I quoted Auden in the brown notebook. I and the public knew what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. But not always, I scribbled below. We exhumed an inappropriate babysitter, a chubby 14-year-old with a contralto laugh who liked to lie over his lap and make him spank her, and a difficult mother, the opposite of C, but no real sexual evil. By the middle of the summer, we stopped trying. If it's buried deep, he said. Why did you come to me when you did? I asked. I called you because of a girl, he said. He hadn't in the least invited the situation. In fact, he avoided one-on-one time with his own daughters. He tended to take them places together, though he planned activities for himself with his son. I couldn't imagine that kind of carefulness with my children. This girl, he said, followed him around at work for 3 weeks as a project for school. And she fell for him, the 8th grader's crush so obvious it became a joke in the office. Even her father, the CFO, laughed about it. For Kay, this felt excruciating because there was a current between them, and she was showing it while he had to act as if it didn't exist. She asked him for a 3-day-a-week internship. He said no. She slows me down, he told her father. I spend all my time explaining the law. The CFO was offended because Kay had insufficiently gushed. Isabel, her name was. Everyone else in the office loves Izzy, the CFO pointedly said. It was over now. He hadn't seen her or heard about her for 8 months. He had never once asked her father what she was doing or whether she trekked through Orange County for the Christmas bird count. She talked about that. She kept a notebook with her sightings of local birds. She told him about a population of wild red-crowned parrots that had been growing since the 40s, when a flock escaped from a truck hurtling north from Mexico to a Bakersfield pet store. Now he read about birds whenever there was an article in the paper. He'd grown more attached to the family dog. So you had your love story, I said. I fell in love in an impossible way. That's what we call wrong object. Our hope is to keep those feelings and direct them to someone else. I said that, but I didn't know whether it was possible. Right object, he said. Well, we all know who that would be. I sometimes think I love my dog more than my wife. A generation ago, someone sat in a chair like mine and listened to a person talk about a different wrong object. In offices all over North America, psychiatrists attempted conversion therapies. My takeaway from those sad chapters of the history of psychology was that you could scare people and make them celibate. You could maybe stop them from doing what they had the urge to do, but it was nearly impossible to implant an alternate desire. The arc of gay liberation had a good ending, at least in California, but Kay's problem never could. We'd already gone 10 minutes over time, and Kay was still talking when I told him we had to stop. He looked at me with gratitude as he stood. He seemed relieved. His secrecy was ending, but mine had just begun. Now I knew there was a real child. I wished he hadn't told me her name. Shrinks promise confidentiality, but everyone breaks that promise. I talked to my husband about my patients, and not only to him. I'd once puzzled out a couples case with my running partner, but I couldn't tell anyone about Kay. I didn't want to. I felt pretty sure no one would understand. I spent hours on the internet. The case law was iffy. Child pornography was illegal and could have arguably been subject to mandatory reporting. I hoped he wasn't watching porn. I slid into bed next to my sleeping husband. I may have been honor-bound to tell my supervising analyst, but Dr. Baer was leaving for a 9-week writing retreat in Scotland, where he planned to devote himself to a memoir in verse about his first marriage to a wife who died young. Over the next weeks, Kay told me about his first object. We talked in it and around it, the way music reorganizes itself. We added a second session Thursday mornings. The summer he was 13, Kay had fallen in love with a friend of his sister's, a girl named Natalie. His family had rented a house in Malibu, and he followed the two girls everywhere. The ends of her hair touched her hips. She had stick legs, dark compared with his own freckled skin. He was a geek then, he told me, with acne. I thought I would grow out of that and be one of those guys who had a beautiful younger wife, he said. His mother, in fact, was a beautiful wife, 16 years younger than his father. The 3 children slept on a porch cantilevered over sand and heard the thunder of rippling waves all night long. Annalie's wrist had brushed against his, but that was all until the day before he left. His parents had decided to return home early, when the 3 waded into the ocean and his sister ran back to get a popsicle from the refrigerator. He watched her trudging up the sand and thought her bum was too big. Anna tied her hair up in a knot by touch alone, her elbows out to the sides of her ears. He was standing, but just barely, with ridged sand under his feet. The waves lifted him up and down. It was like jumping without gravity. Their bodies found each other, and he felt her legs waving underwater like sea fronds when her knees touching both sides of his. She placed her hands on his shoulders, which were rising up and down too. She kissed him, and the inside of her mouth tasted of melon, the musky flavor he hadn't liked, but now did. The smell of sea, the knob of her ankle on his back, her hands light on his shoulders, bobbing up and down with the surf. They laughed, looking at each other because they fit. Then suddenly a huge wave came and unlatched them, hurling them tumbling in foam, and when they emerged 9 feet apart, her face was covered with her netted hair, the rubber band lost to the sea. His mother, in a yellow blouse, stood waving from the deck. His sister was returning, her splayed feet sinking in the sand. The sun puckered the surface of the ocean. Their eyes shone, their hair plastered against their skin. He left for New York with his family the next day and never saw her again. But the age of the girls he loved did not march up the staircase with him. He desired a 13-year-old when he was 13, when he was in high school, then when he was in his 20s and 30s. The penchant never changed. He'd married at 36. I asked if he thought of telling C then. He hadn't. I mean, how would you bring it up? By the way, I'm not really all that attracted to you. I thought that he could tell her now. But what if she ran out of the house with the children and hired a divorce lawyer? I read about a Canadian psychiatrist who closed down his practice and sent former patients on whom he'd attempted conversion therapy letters of apology with refund checks. Apparently, that doctor went bankrupt. My supervisor summoned me for one last meeting before he left for Scotland. He had a fire going in his office fireplace. I'd never known it worked. Gas, he said when I stared. He always offered me coffee during our sessions, and I accepted, though it was late afternoon. He wore a flannel shirt under his suit jacket and hiking boots, already dressed for his retreat. He efficiently ran through each of my patients. He asked me about Kay only once. What about the purse? I told him the truth. I'd forgotten it. He's not boring you anymore? No, I said. I wished him well on his book, hoping I would see him again. At his age, I couldn't be sure. And then it was just Kay and me. What does it mean to be a non-acting, minor attracted person, I asked, which is what he'd started to call himself. For some people, I suppose, he said, it would mean they can't have sex, not real sex. But that's not you, I said. You're not celibate. Not exactly. With that qualifier, it seemed I'd bitten a tip of cardboard. If a guy in a bar says, my wife and I have great sex, and his buddy says, meh, ours is so-so, what does that even tell you? Maybe the one so-so would have been the other guy's nirvana. I asked about his fantasies. It's pretty much always the same, he said. We're in water, she's skinny, teasing, she coaxes me. I have to be pulled into the game. No face usually, but a girl, that body. Do you think of this fantasy to become aroused with your wife? My running partner once told me she had to imagine being raped to come, and the ickiness bothered her so much that orgasms didn't seem worth the trouble. She'd read about arousal reconditioning in a women's magazine. In the 60s, psychologists had patients masturbate to a favorite fantasy and then replace that with something more acceptable just seconds before climax when it was too late to stop. Gradually, they pulled the switch back until finally the idea went, the patient wouldn't need the fantasy at all. But arousal reconditioning therapy failed. At least it failed to make gay people straight. My running partner said she couldn't completely obliterate the need for violence, but now she only required a minute or two. I'd also read about satiation training, which was kind of the opposite. Patients masturbated to their favorite fantasy over and over again until they wore them out. I'll try window number 1, Kay said, now that we're picking from discredited therapies. How many times a week do I have to do this? 2 or 3, I said. She's going to wonder what's gotten into me. He had been having sex with his wife all along, but not a lot. Still, he said, not appreciably less than their friends. Unlike with those couples, though, Kay was the one who demurred. Sometimes during dinners out, the men made jokes about missing the sex-rich time before marriage, looking at their wives with blame. This humiliated his wife. But after 2 weeks of the regime and Kay's apparently newfound appetite, they laughed together about their previous imbalance. At the end of 5 weeks, C called a moratorium. This is a little too much for me, she told him. Instead, she signed them up for a Ligurian cooking class. The chef would come to them. How had it worked? I don't know, he said. Without the fantasy, her naked face was like an old friend. Kay had an unusually large mouth, his lips pressed together in an exaggeratedly tight smile, which he held a moment, then let down. Oh, that's a grimace, I realized. Sometimes I understood what a word meant from reading, but had never met it in real life. I asked again whether he could tell her. I thought it was worth the risk, but he didn't want to. You've never asked me about porn, he said. I raised a hand, meaning stop. He waved me off. I always knew it was out there. Last night, I finally watched one on my computer. The thing felt homemade. There was a girl, 11 or 12. She looked poor, more young than pretty. It was supposed to be her first time. You could see she was scared. He was much bigger and rough. The guy was hurting her, and you could see he wanted to. He was getting off on her fear. I closed my computer to stop it. My fantasy, he said. It was never that at all. He returned to his first concern, his marriage. Okay, so I don't have the sparkle, he said, or whatever that is. But my question is still the same. Do I love her enough? The problem is choice. If you turn away from your instincts, you're left with rationality, essentially with shopping. There is something repellent about deciding to pick a person that way. This one's a wonderful cook. That one looks great dressed up. This one's fluent in 3 languages but disorganized. Isn't that more or less what we all do? I said. Really? Well, few of us marry paraplegics. You married a paraplegic? He asked. No, I said. I did the usual thing. Maybe we're done, Kay said. The one thing we haven't tried is telling your wife. He shook his head. This is enough for me. Why should she have to learn that she had her children with a monster? She could have married plenty of other guys. I'd written statistics on a 3x5 card. But what could I say? You are not alone? After that, the life went out of our sessions. He canceled frequently for trips. More family trips, I noted, fewer business. He no longer seemed miserable. By the summer, he'd stopped coming altogether. That might have been the happy end of our story. Dr. Bear eventually returned from Scotland, where he'd broken a leg walking on a rocky crag. The footsteps, he said, helped his prosody. He'd had to spend the last 6 weeks of his retreat in a Swiss rehabilitation facility. This time, no fire burned in the marble fireplace. He offered coffee as usual, but I declined in deference to the plastic boot on his leg. I summarized my cases, skipping lightly over Kay's termination. I'm still not getting a clear sense of your work with him, he said. I always thought something would emerge from all that boredom. Maybe now that it was over, I could tell him more. I wanted to talk about Kay. None of my current patients engaged me as much. I looked at Dr. Bear's long, pale face. I looked at Dr. Bear's long face, pale and weaker from his trip, and remembered him saying, I don't think you're less. I decided to trust him. I started to describe our work, what we'd accomplished, what we left unfinished. But his gaze focused, his eyebrows rose. I'm surprised at you, he said. He never touched a minor. He came to get help. According to his own report, did he engage in pornography? I could have lied. Well, only once, I finally said. I tried to remember my statistics. There are something like 4 million child porn websites, and he hated it. He didn't do anything, I said, too loud. He came to me to learn how to live with these feelings. If something happened to him for seeking help, that would be a really bad thing. I saw I'd made a mistake. I wanted to ask him to promise he wouldn't report Kay, but instead I flattered him, asking how his work on the memoir had gone, whether he'd been able to finish. He shook his head and told me that he'd made some progress, but not as much as he'd hoped. A few weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, there was a knock on my office door. A woman introduced herself as Catherine. Someone had reported her husband, she told me. There had been an investigation. He hadn't done anything, she said, so of course he'd been cleared. I thought of explaining that it wasn't me who'd reported him, but it was anyway, I supposed, my fault. Kay had obviously told her almost everything. What I'd hoped for had come true. She stood here, his ally, her black hair pulled back in a ponytail. They were no doubt closer from their mutual rage. She was stately, truly beautiful, with large Grecian features. She was not carrying the purse that looked like a plastic shopping bag, but dressed with classical good taste, a knit suit, modest heels at the end of long, slim calves. He'd never once told me C was beautiful, her proportions probably wasted on him. I'm sure he hadn't thought of me in those terms at all. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't want this to happen. He feels terribly betrayed. We both do, she said. I left my office, taping a note on the door to cancel my later session, and I meandered on residential streets, walking in and out of pockets of sound, leaf blowers, illegal but still used everywhere here, and occasionally a choir of birds under an inexplicably hospitable tree. I'd started noticing birds. Without meaning to, Kay had given me the inclination. It may have been all Kay still had from the girl. I thought about Dr. Baer. I was just a beginner and he was an eminence, but our relationship wasn't what I'd believed. At least Isabel, the girl, had been spared. No doubt by now she'd forgotten her crush. Perhaps she'd begun dating in the way of our high schoolers via text and Instagram. I wondered if she'd kept her love of birds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. Wow, what a story. Amazing. Okay, I want to open this up for everyone to ask questions. And I would encourage you to turn your cameras on so that we're all present to each other, as we would be at a regular reading. And if anybody, or if you prefer to type a question into the chat, please feel free. I'll be monitoring that as well. I guess I want to ask you, just to start off, perhaps, you know, you were primarily known as a novelist, and yet, of course, you have written short fiction throughout your career. What do you see as the pressures or the challenges or opportunities of writing novels versus the short story?
They're so different. I don't know. That's a good question. I think that you can. I'm not sure I would have wanted to spend a whole novel's worth of time with the people, for example, in this story. So it gives you a chance to, I don't know, I think it gives you a chance to explore more variety, you know, to do things in a shorter time, which is such a pleasure.
Good. I'm just going to say it. I could not help but think of Poe's House of Usher in hearing your story. I don't know if you were thinking of that or if that's...
Well, I was thinking of just sort of channeling that through Nabokov, of course.
Well, right, of course,
Yeah.
as well, yeah. But when when Anna Lee came into it, I thought...
Yeah, that's why I thought that was...
Right.
I like these little references, they're fun.
Yeah, that was fun. Good. Please, people have questions, raise a hand, raise a virtual hand, put something into the chat. Anyone? Elise.
Hi. How do you navigate writing about such controversial material?
Oh God, I don't know. You know, I think you don't even think. I don't know. What do you do? I don't even think about it when I'm doing it, and then I guess I worry about it later. I once wrote a novel which is half in the voice of a Filipino nanny. And I was almost done with it. I'd been working on it for years and years, and I went and gave a reading. And Jeffrey Wolf, who I like very much, was the head of the program at Irvine where I'd given the reading. And he said, you know, aren't you worried about this? Aren't you worried that you're going to be, you know, clobbered for appropriating another culture's language? And it literally, I hadn't even thought of it when I was doing it. And I'm glad I hadn't thought of it, because I'm sure I would have worried about it. But I don't know. I think I think it's between you and yourself whether how authentic your impulse is. I mean, I wouldn't want to. For example, I happen to be, of all things, half Syrian. Now, I didn't grow up in Syria. I've been to Syria, but I didn't grow up in a particularly Syrian family. My parents were divorced. I lived with the non-Syrian one. I lived with the American one. but just the fact that I'm, literally, physically half Syrian, I think if I wrote a book which had a Syrian 35-year-old attorney, no one would question it because they would feel I had some sort of authenticity to that. But in fact, I don't know if I really would have. I think honestly, I wrote the Filipino nanny out of a time when I was a young mother going to the park, and in the park where I went every day at the time I happened to be there were not other mothers. I guess I picked an unpopular time, so it was sort of for mothers. It was all nannies, and it was either Spanish-speaking nannies or English-speaking nannies. So naturally, I gravitated to the English-speaking nannies, and they were mostly Filipinas. So I had those voices in my head for years and years, and I felt much more honest with their voices than I would have with something that might have been, technically speaking, more in my lane. So I don't worry about it. I don't think I'd try to do something, I wouldn't try to do something that I felt I couldn't do really honestly and with some, I wouldn't do something where I didn't feel I could enter the character deeply. But I don't know.
We have a question in the chat. What made you choose the therapist as your narrator and not, say, the wife or the supervisor?
That's a good question. I don't know. It sort of started with the therapist, and it once had more of the therapist. I had her more as a young sort of fumbling therapist, and I cut most of her back. So she's now the narrator, but there's not as much about her as there was. So I think I really started with her in that role. I don't know what made me, I'm not sure what started that story.
Other questions? People's hands? Brendan Matthews.
Hi, thanks so much for reading tonight. You mentioned not being sure what inspired the story you read, but I'm just curious, whatever you're working on now, what's drawn you to that material? You mentioned, to answer Peter's first question, there's a different pull to the novel, to the short story, but whatever's consuming your writing time now, do you have a sense of what was the spark, or what's the thing that's kept you interested in whatever that happens to be?
Yeah, in this one, I really did have a really specific thing. There was an essay by Oliver Sacks, of all things, called, I think, A Nostalgia for the Asylum or something like that, it was an essay which was published, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. And it was about his work. He worked for many, many years in a state, what we think of as the snake pit, sort of a state mental health hospital. And as we know, in the early part of his career, he worked for, I think, 25 years in a state mental health hospital. And as we all know, those institutions have been emptied, and starting in '63 with Kennedy's bill, we tried to move mental health treatment into the communities, and that didn't work so well. But the big model of the state mental health hospital is that era is over in America, and we don't do that anymore. I myself actually in real life grew up with a mentally ill parent, with one single mentally ill parent who managed to live in the outside world, but with great cost to herself. So this novel is kind of it's kind of an imagination. It's my imagining, and I changed up the circumstances. I grew up alone with a single mother. This in the book, she has 3 children, so I've changed up a lot. But it's sort of it's kind of challenging the notion of whether that we all have from Cuckoo's Nest, that this was such a terrible way of living. Because I sort of saw I guess I felt like I saw the other side of somebody struggling to hold themselves together. And I wondered, and I'd read a lot of accounts of people after the Oliver Sacks. I read a lot of accounts of people who actually had found a certain amount of, obviously there were lots of abuses in mental health hospitals too. But there is also a body of literature of people who found a certain amount of peace and more nurturing culture than they would have been able to otherwise.
And how is that narrated? Who's your entry point there? Is it through the mother or through the children or through some outside voice?
It's actually three children, and it's a third person. It's a third person, close third.
Yeah.
Another question in the chat. The research part of this story must have been disturbing. How do you handle that or separate from that when you're writing?
Actually, the research part of this story was really interesting, and I wish I were a better. I wish I were more of a reporter sometimes. I started out as a reporter when I was a kid writer, when I was just out of college. And it was actually really, really, really interesting, because it turns out that the way we handle sex crimes against children is very different than the way some countries in Europe do. And there's a program in Germany that I read about that has a phenomenal success rate, which does not treat, we pretty much, I mean, it's funny because I'm trying to think, in a class at Bard College, we saw a movie called Capturing the Freedmans, which is a really good movie. But there was one girl in the class, I found myself thinking, how did you get to Bard? This is such an un-Bardian point of view, but she was just like, if anyone has if anyone is even attracted, even if they've never touched a kid, I think they should be locked up. I mean, she just she couldn't fathom the idea. And I think we do as a culture to some extent vilify, to a big extent, vilify pedophiles, which I think that it even seems almost natural to me, having grown up in this culture. But I think the idea in Germany is, in this program, which is quite a big program at this point, is, there's nothing wrong with the impulse, just don't, we have to make sure you never ever do it. You can have whatever feelings internally you want to feel. We have to figure out a way for you to live. And so I think that there actually is a lot of research being done and stuff. It was actually really interesting doing the reporting for this.
The therapist says at the start of the story, if I recall right, I've always thought of myself as being part of a helping profession.
Yeah.
Do you think writing is? Do you think stories, novels?
I wonder. I think that's a question. I bet all the writers in the room, which is probably most of the room, I bet we're all wondering that, especially right now. We're in the middle of an international pandemic. I'm in California, where there are these apocalyptic fires, which we can't seem to contain and which now happen every year. We're in an incredibly imperiled political situation. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wish I felt it was more, I do believe, I think certainly my life has been enormously helped. And I would even be hyperbolic enough to say that, literature saved my life or something like that. I actually believe that, as corny as it sounds. But I think it's not a very, it's a very different kind of helping profession than being a therapist or a doctor or, even an activist, I think.
Well, I was struck by the lines that you quote from Auden, are of course from his elegy to Yeats, where he also says, poetry makes nothing happen, right? So that tension between the two.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, that's always the writer's fear, I think.
Yes. Another question in the chat, just wondering, speaking of the large mental institutions of the past, if you've seen the new show Wretched, about the
No, in fact, I just read about it and I'm dying to see it.
I saw the first episode. Woo! Man, it's pretty hard nails, right? Yeah. Does it get better? I'd be curious. I'm curious to watch more.
Yeah, I'm eager to see that. I really want to see it.
Pretty well done. Others, please. Real hands, chats, virtual hands, at all whatsoever. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and please keep track of our other reading events coming up, and feel free to come back for the Poetry and Fiction series at Simon's Rock. Mona, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely fabulous story.
Thanks.
And I'll see you on a quick Zoom call to follow. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.